This week, we will talk about one of the oldest Christian traditions in Africa that exists in eastern region near the Horn of Africa, Ethiopian Christian Church. Its history and its legacy is quite different from other Christian traditions where Christianity was brought to the region from missionaries operating in Europe. In the case of the tradition in Ethiopia, there's historic evidence that suggests they converted at a very early year when the kingdom of Aksum flourished around the 1st century, 7th century. It was around the 3rd century, much earlier than many other parts of the world, in fact, that Axum becomes this new Christian kingdom. The story that relates to this is Axum is a fairly powerful, affluent country that's essentially at a point where trading with the Middle East and Egypt and India is heating up, and this is sort of this trade route here. And this kingdom here has some very, very interesting early features, one of which was during the Axum period. Early Axum period was the erection of these giant stone stelae, which were in commemoration to deceased kings. And these stones, there are 7 which were originally quite large, about 100 or more than 100 feet tall. And these stone stelae, you could see, are carved with a kind of architectural details. They don't actually have windows and doors and stonework, but they seem to represent kind of building with a very unique qualities and design, something that very similar to might have been, could be found in Rome with some of the designs somewhere from there. So there's a wide variety of style. There's, like say 7 really large ones, but numerous others smaller, just simple erected stones, depending on the status of the social status of the person and wealth of the person who died. And then a very important thing happens. We see in AD 324, King Ezanza converts to Christianity. And there may be a coincidence here, but about the same time, this massive and most intricate of the stelae, while it was being erected, cracked and collapsed, and its remains still lie in this area. And it may have been the impetus for the conversion to Christianity. You can see its remains lying here. Now, the stelae have a long history in Ethiopia, but one of the 7 tall stelae was actually captured in World War II by the Italians and cut up and shipped off and spent many years in Rome, where it was re-erected. In 1947, the United Nations agreement after the war, the obelisk should be shipped back. Italy has been refusing to return it for many years, and then finally, in April of 2005, Italy returned the obelisk pieces to Axum, and Italy also agreed to pay the $4 million cost of the transfer. And in 2007, this obelisk has now been re-erected in Ethiopia. And this is one of the things that's been happening in many parts of our story of African art, is artwork that had been captured or collected or stolen from many parts of Africa are slowly being repatriated. And this is a happy ending. King Ezanza, who converted to Christianity, a stone was recently uncovered in the 1980s where we see a very interesting inscription. It's in 3 languages, like the Rosetta Stone. It's in Ethiopian Semitic Ge'ez, which is a language that of the Christian Church of Ethiopia. So it's in Ge'ez, a South Arabian Sabaean language, and Greek. And so these 3 languages are carved on this stone, and it's an inscription by the king that proclaims his glory and is asking for a tax. And it also mentions his desire to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia, to his kingdom. There is a history that says that there is this long-standing belief in Ethiopia that the Ark of the Covenant from the Old Testament was brought to Ethiopia and is now currently housed in this secret church. Secret in the sense that nobody except the church elders are allowed into the compound, and nobody, not even the one person who guards this day and night, is allowed to actually see the ark sealed within its vaults. So this original site of this church goes back all the way to the 4th century CE. And this current building you see in this picture is actually built in the 1980s, and with King Haile Selassie. His wife footed the bill for that. And so there is this long-standing sense that there's this sort of ancient legacy, this connection to this Ethiopian Christian church really represents this sort of lost bastion of a true, pure creed of Christianity that has remained true to its faith all through the centuries. The Zagwe dynasty comes in and establishes a kind of desire to create a kind of Jerusalem in this region by building a number of really spectacular churches. These churches are carved from a solid block of stone. This was largely the work of King Gabriel Misque Lalibela, and the Lalibela churches are a World Heritage Site in Africa. They are really remarkable. And again, like the Axum Stela, they show this really sophisticated carvings of stone and design that integrate a kind of architecture that is quite miraculous. The total number of stone churches in Ethiopia is 11. And the most spectacular of these solid rock stones is the St. George Church, built in the 13th century. And you can see here, unlike the other churches, which tend to be sort of square-shaped, this has a kind of cruciform shape to it. You can kind of look down and you see this kind of equal length armed cross is cut into the stone on the roof. Now, these churches had a number of important things. One, qualities that why they were built this way. They were cut into living rock, going straight down. So that if you're walking along on the surface of the ground, they're very actually hard to see, because even though they're sort of monumental, they're really sort of monumental underground. That at this time, there's a great deal of conflict between Muslims and Christians in this area. And that these churches, because they were hard to see, they would not become suspect to attack. Also, getting access to them. Not only there's no easy access when you see the church. You actually have to go down, and there's a sort of maze of narrow alleyways that wind through the rock to these churches, which again protects them and makes them much more defensible. After the Zagwe dynasty, we have the emergence of this sort of Ptolemaic period, which goes from about the late 13th century all the way to about the 17th century. Here we start to see a number of painting traditions that have survived, and we get to understand the role of the icon in the way in which these sacred books, which are really sort of picture books of icons, some writing and textual things, but a lot of them the book is not seen as a kind of reference to the content of the book, which is written elsewhere. The book becomes a religious source of spiritual energy and is considered a kind of sacred or holy object. This icon is clothed with a human body. It moves and talks. The Spirit of God dwell in it. You should not think that it is a mere picture. So, like elsewhere in Christian traditions, the books are sacred, and that the book is believed to be the source of teaching. It is like a person speaking to you. It's not just a book recording what someone said. It is indeed like the body of the saint or the apostle. It is revealing that truth directly to you. Here, when we look at this painting of St. Luke in the 15th century, it's very worn with age, and you can see that the wearing of the page has revealed a kind of grid that has worn off in where the painted parts are. The stylization of the figure and the lines in the body suggest that initially each page in these books is inscribed with lines which are possible to be used for text, but then if it's used for a drawing, the proportions and the illustration on the text also conforms to these lines that are already there. We can see the head and the position of the face relative to, and the eyes are all fit within the sort of grid pattern that was pre-established for this page as a written document. Here in the 17th century, we start to see, again, another very important icon, the two that are most important, St. George, the saint who battles the dragon and sort of preserves Christianity through his struggles with this sort of symbolic demon or devil of the pagan world, and the Virgin Mary. And in this case here, this icon, we can see the two of them. It's called a censal. It's a book that is actually a codex, a kind of accordion folded book. And these objects are sacred to the church, and they would be kept in secret and only brought out during times of the festivals and there are lots of the sort of holiday festivals such as Easter, when these icons would come out and be paraded before the people so that their spiritual power might disseminate among them. So this is about 3 inches by 4 inches folded prayer book for private reading and prayer. The centermost painting could be opened, and like you see here, the two in the center here are the two most important, St. George and Mary and the Christ child. Those would be the most important of the two parts of this book in the very center. So objects are part of the kind of religious practices that are processionals, these kind of ways in which the church makes its presence known and plays an important role in blessing the community. The processional cross is also a very important role because it is a way in which people interact with the church in a very physical and visceral way. These fairly large cut bronze and brass and sometimes silver or iron crosses are intricately cut and placed on a pole. Each of these usually has a kind of 2 hoops near the base where the cross attaches to the pole, and through that they hoop this long fabric. The long fabric allows it to be like clothing for the cross. It's usually thought of as a kind of dressed for the occasion. And as people walk with them, the movement of the cloth is supposed to suggest the blowing, the air, the fertility, and the blessing of the cross out into the public who are present. The cross cloth also plays a very important role as people might kiss the cross. Then it is wiped off. It also means that people might actually just touch or kiss the cloth itself. A very interesting idea about the cross in its equal dimensions so that each of the arms are of equal length. There's this concept in the Ethiopian Christian Church of the cosmic cross. And the cross is symbolic of lots of different things, not just the 4 Gospels and the 4 Apostles, but the 4 rivers of the Garden of Paradise, the 4 cardinal directions. And it's meant to represent this cross, which encompasses all things, all places, all directions. And that's the way in which it breaks apart and in that decorative way suggests that sense of a diffuse, omnipresent cross. Here's some other really extraordinary examples you can see of this cross design. They all have fascinating variations of knotwork and intricate patterns and cutting. It kind of draws them together, this idea of this sort of infinite cross, especially like the one that is really just a square that kind of moves across a vast field. Though it's slightly damaged in the upper portion, the central portion here, where there's just one missing hole, creates this idea of the cross in the center of this field. So these are some of the sort of basic conventions and traditions in the Ethiopian Christian church. There are a number of traditions and practices which are on the periphery of the Christian church, which are have been seriously condoned, seriously prohibited at times, or condoned at others. This is the way in which the prayer scroll functions. And I find these really interesting because this is another way in which people interact with the church. The church provides them with these amulets, and these amulets provide them with protection from the evil eye and curses and misfortune and things like that. So the prayer scrolls are made for an individual, and they require a lot of very special care in their construction. The prayers that are contained within the scroll are specifically chosen for the individual and their concerns and their maladies and their history. And this prayer scroll is then created from the skin of a single animal that is sacrificed and prayers are said, and then the leather is stretched and made so that its length is the exact height of the person the prayer scroll is for. And then it's rolled up really tightly and it's put into a container that someone will wear around their neck. In the center of these prayer scrolls is usually an illustration, and that can be one of two things. It can either be an angel, like you see here, or it could be a devil. We'll talk about those in a little bit. You see over on the right, that is the entire length of the prayer scroll, and that drawing that we see on the left, that can be found right in the center of that prayer scroll. So these are created by Dabtara, an unordained cleric. So clerics are the church officials that are responsible for maintaining church traditions. And so the Dabtara do this as a way of kind of to get the training they need in writing this ancient language of Ge'ez, and as a way of kind of informing them about certain traditions. It's a way to make a little bit of money on the side while they're waiting to be ordained, developing their time to be ordained. And so this is a talisman. And the word talisman that we use is actually very similar to the word it's used in Ethiopian, talisam, Arabic, tilasam, and Greek, tilasama. And so these words all kind of relate together. And a talisman is an object of magical powers. It's a thing that's meant to have a kind of thing. We'll talk more about magic next section. It's a really fascinating subject. It'll come up quite a bit. And some of the particulars of what makes magic work for most people. But I do want to talk a little bit more about some of the symbolism. We would say the central image could either be an angel, or it can be, in this case here, a demon. And the demon is very important because it's supposedly a kind of good demon, a demon that's sort of on our side. And this, people have related, the Wurzelia is the idea in the Ethiopian tradition. It comes from the Gorgon. The Gorgon was this terrifying monster, but it also, and we see the Gorgon's head, it was prominently featured on many doorways as a way of kind of scaring off evil spirits, that people kept this evil visage above their doorway as a way of kind of frightening off and dissuading other evils. So this is the sort of the evil you want to keep on your side. So this way in which the animal, the protective spirits, were these talismans were very important for people to get access to the church and feel the church is there, to protect them in this particular way. Now I want to tell you about a very interesting artist who was trained as a cleric and was one of these Dabtaras, who made a very unique kind of talisman. His name was Gideon Makonnen, and he was a literary scholar, writer, and this extraordinary artist. And he decided to sort of change the form of the talisman. They're no longer made on leather, they were made on paper. And he began developing his own symbols and ideas about what is a talisman. And he called his unique variants on the talisman tradition talismans of research and study. And he called them that because he really wanted to sort of engage in the kind of modern world and to kind of comment on and put these talismans into a context of people's lives and the kinds of symbols and things that they were familiar with. So he initially draws a black ink image and then goes through the black ink and energizes it with this red ink. He's also writing in Ge'ez. He's really also sort of influenced in, you say, comic books. We can actually see French comic characters in these various sort of panels, and that in these sort of panels, he's also included a kind of text, which is the talismanic text. And I have a quote from it here. I take refuge in the power of your names and in your art and in your wisdom, in what you have created and pronounced, so that I am not approached by all those who cast spells, the devils, the impure spirits to the north, to the south, etc. So this is a sort of kind of language that would have been found on one of these prayer scrolls. Gideon had a very interesting transformation. As his work gained in popularity, he created more and more fantastic works. He created these really large, beautifully, intricately drawn, complex, interwoven designs. And these are things that I've seen in the museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He would die in 1990, just as he was sort of gaining international fame and notoriety. So it's a very interesting way in which a traditional artist sort of comes to and invents sort of new traditions. And we'll talk more about this in the third section when we get to talk about modernity and interaction with tradition. But this is just a really interesting take on this traditional practices that I thought I would include here. There are traditional artists today that continue to paint in the Ethiopian Christian way. After Haile Selassie was deposed, there was a period of time when Ethiopia was a secular state, but it has returned to its Christian past, and it has become a very important sort of repository of creating and re-envisioning a lot of these ancient traditions. So in today's Ethiopia, there are a number of paintings which often featured important historical events in the history of Ethiopia. This here, the Battle of Adwa, March 1896, was a sort of historic turning point in the history of Ethiopia, where the Italian army attacked the Ethiopian army, and the Italian army was defeated. And this was a really big, significant event in that it was one of the very few times in the history of the modern world where a colonial power, European power, was routed by native peoples in defense of their own land. And this was a very important sort of defining and rallying cry that echoed throughout Africa and much of Asia as well. And there are lots of different depictions of this battle. You can see here yet another treatment of the Battle of Adwa. If you're ever in Champaign at the Art Museum, the Cranert, I highly recommend you go there and take a look at their art collection. They also have a painting of the Battle of Adwa on their walls. Another very interesting tradition goes to the story of the Kibra Nagas, the glory of kings, which recounts the ancient history of Ethiopian Christian church and how Christianity came to Ethiopia. In this legendary account, we see the Queen of Sheba legend being told, where Queen of Sheba, this African queen, she goes to Solomon. And in this story, we know that Sheba becomes pregnant and her son Menelik is born, and he is recognized by Solomon, and he returns to Africa. And this is sort of where the connection between ancient Ethiopia and this early Christian church, really Judaism, was what they adopted at this time. And so also the story recounts the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant. So this is a very popular depiction. You can see here these panels all have a kind of formal way of rendering the story and depicting it so that people can enjoy the tale even today.